I come at this from a slightly different place in that I feel my job is to explain where the government is doing things catastrophically wrongly and wasting your money. And I feel like my relationship with, if I'm bad cop often to Meg's good cop, I suspect. Well, you're constructed at least. I think it's worth talking about the machinery of government changes, which I think I start from the assumption, as Gavin does and Gavin Steen does in the report, that machinery of government change is always less important and less interesting than they at first sound. Fundamentally, the same people doing the same job with a slightly different brass plate shouldn't make that much difference. But I think there are important exceptions this time around. The first one is obviously the new Brexit departments. The creation of the Department of International Trade is going to be an interesting thing. I think Britain's going to learn quite fast how boring international trade is. Right? There's a lot of, if you look at the most optimistic forecasts about what we could get from potential third-party trade deals as an independent state, there are no revolutions, coming. The capacity of any individual trade and any individual trade secretary to fundamentally transform the way the British economy works is unbelievably small. And these things take years and years and years. So if you are a trade minister, you might get to be, like the Canadian trade minister, Chrystia Freeland at the moment, you might get to be the person there when you sign a big deal, or you might spend your whole career never having done anything. So if I were placing a bet now, I would suggest that DIT is not going to survive in the long term because it politically doesn't make sense as a unit. It will be folded back into DTI, whatever we're going to call it now. The second thing is the Department for Education MOG changes. They're quite interesting because they've placed FE and HE inside the schools department, basically. It's worth bearing in mind that there are lots of people who say, and lots of academics, that this is brilliant, we're educationalists, this is what we stand for, we should never have been with business, it misunderstood the culture of our institutions. But I think they misunderstand the culture of their institutions and what their institutions are for and what we, the public, pay them to do. As much as they might like it, there are three really big problems I think with it. The first is they are now standing inside a budget line with a thing that cannot stay inside its budget. The Department for Education has had real trouble with its accountancy lately. There have been overspends, actually unforgivably I should say, overspends, given that it's not like we get shocking increases in the number of 13-year-olds mid-year. We know how many schools there are, and we fix the amount we pay them. They shouldn't be having trouble, but they have been. And they're now in the budget line. They are the buffer between the DEL and the school's budget. If I were at the FE system in particular, I'd be really troubled by that because they have a fair amount of grant funding that can be easily taken should the DFE run into more trouble with its school accountancy in the next few years. The person running the Department for Education, you might have noticed, is now running the Department for Health. So it's promotion to greatness. It's much higher stakes having not really coped at the Department for Education with the budget line. I don't understand the civil service. The other thing I think is worth bearing in mind at the DFE is the apprenticeship levy. The apprenticeship levy is a huge undertaking, combined with the 3 million apprenticeship target. What the two things do together is they remove the incentive for employers and the government to care about apprenticeship quality. So it used to be the case that an apprenticeship paid for by an employer, the employer would have an incentive to make sure that their employee was getting trained properly. That is no longer the case because of the levy. It used to be the case that the government was putting in money and would care about quality. That is no longer the case because of the target. And there is strong grounds to presume as well, if you are a company who basically doesn't have to pay for it anymore, but you get to pay your staff less if they are apprentices, less than the minimum wage, that there will be huge grounds for abuse. This is an enormous task to make sure this doesn't happen, to make sure we retain standards, to make sure there's not abuse, and there doesn't seem to be any interest across Whitehall in making sure that this quite big project, which will require HMRC, Ofsted, the DFE, and BAYS, BIS, DTI to pay attention to it, So I think they have lots of capacity for things to go wrong, and moving this thing into the DFE, which has no interest or knowledge about of its own about FE, might not be the smartest thing to do at this critical juncture. I think there's on that sort of subject of things that can go wrong, I think we need to talk more about the customs, I can't remember what it's called, the CDS, the customs declaration system, I think it is, the new replacement for CHIEF, the customs computer system, which is supposed to be coming online in 2018. It's a large government IT project. The government is changing the specifications of it halfway through. Great. We also need to talk about customs and border control, and if we have to suddenly start stopping lorries in Dover, in the port of Dover, where do they go? Where is that going to happen? All of that sort of quite dull stuff might have to happen quite fast. And there are going to be huge implementation challenges for the service around that. On accountability, I think we have to change the tone of voice in which we talk about accountability and transparency in particular. So when I was at the FT, we put a person on the project of looking through what was then called coins, and I think, it was then called OSCO, and it's now called coins, or the other way around. I can't remember. No one uses it. It's useless. I mean, we use us. It's just we set someone a task of compiling and building a sort of usable version of the database, and could not find any use for it. Just could not work out what things like you would say. Okay, well, let's just check. We'll try and reconcile how much they paid according to the NEO or the national an annual report to an institution with OSCO. You couldn't do it. You would try and find out, and it'll be things like they will spend £37,000, say, on a good, and it'll be split into two payments. So one of them will fall below the threshold and won't be reported, and so you lose random bits of money here and there. It doesn't include, for totally understandable data protection reasons, it doesn't include quite important categories and types of spending. For perfectly understandable and decent corporate confidentiality reasons, it doesn't include lots of payments. And again, it just means that lots of it becomes just useless. It just you get a random residual, and you don't know what the missing portion is. So we can't use it for accountability. As far as I know, there has been one news story that has ever used OSCO or coins, and it was to check the size of a payment that the journalist already knew. It was basically to launder a source, actually. It wasn't used in the way it was intended to. So they couldn't work out where they got information from. They pretended they got it from OSCO. Actually, they hadn't. Like, the whole thing has never been of any help. It's also, as you say in the report, troubling actually how poor quality some of that data is. There is a broader thing about the way we talk about transparency, which is that we talk about transparency as though it's like the 95% 4-hour waiting target in hospitals. It's a thing to which government is aspiring, and it's a thing that we're all working towards. And that's obviously not true. Departments have instant messenger systems that self-delete, which they've commissioned and bought. They're deliberately creating ways of talking to one another that actually it is the single best joke to play on any civil servant, to tell them that the instant messenger systems don't self-delete. These things are commissioned and used precisely because they don't keep records. And there is a case of a department changing its instant messenger system when they discovered it was keeping a record, so that they could auto-default so that it wouldn't keep a record. When you look at what the Cabinet Office does and the way the Cabinet Office behaves, it's obviously a policy. It cannot be any other way. You do not get to be a private secretary to the Prime Minister who is continually making these mistakes every single week. No one has ever been fired in the Cabinet Office for the fact that it is absurdly secretive. It doesn't meet its basic statutory obligations on transparency. No, and it gets in trouble all the time. I mean, the poor guy actually who leads their transparency team, who gets sort of dragged along to events and sits there. People ask questions to the Information Commissioner: when are you going to fire? When are you going to go into the Cabinet Office? When are you going to seize their computers? When are you going to do something? And has to sit there aggressively, saying, actually, we're trying really hard. I mean, it's ridiculous. We all know it. And you can see that ministers have an influence on it. So the Department for Education and the Ministry of Justice have a common thread. You may have noticed they were at one end. But the civil service itself has a policy of not being transparent. And we know that you will never get in trouble. You will never get not promoted because you've not been very good about FOI requests. It simply will never happen. I think I've complained enough. There is a broader, I mean, to finish off with one of my final regular hobby horses, if there were a purpose to regularising the UK government, Whitehall's websites, if the GDS is to have a role on presentation of information to the public that isn't getting in the way, it would be to insist on basic standards about publication. It would be to insist on basic standards about things like actually an FOI officer's email address for every department on the front page. It would be to insist we are responsible for the organogram. We look terrible. The GDS, when this organogram is not up there, where is it going to be? Where is your publication scheme for transparency? They should be taking a policing role in that stuff. If they are to have a role, if we must have the same website design for the HMRC and Ofsted, why we should insist on those basic standards. Anyway, I've complained enough. Thank you.